What happens when pure arrogance meets unbreakable spirit? When a champion who's never tasted defeat faces a man who's built his entire life on getting back up? Dropper if you think you know how this ends. But trust me, you don't. He thought he had already won, until silence changed everything. The MGM Grand Arena buzzed with 20,000 voices, but Marcus, the Destroyer Kane, heard only one thing, his own greatness echoing in his mind. At 28, he was undefeated, untouchable, and utterly convinced that no man on earth could stand against him. His platinum teeth gleamed under the spotlights as he flexed his sculpted frame, each muscle a testament to years of perfection. The lightweight championship belt around his waist wasn't just a prize, it was proof of his superiority over every fighter who dared step into his domain. Kane's entourage surrounded him like disciples worshipping a god. His trainer Jimmy the Snake Rodriguez whispered sweet affirmations, while his manager Victoria Sterling counted the millions flowing into their accounts. Reporters hung on his every word, cameras captured his every movement, and social media exploded with his cocky predictions. He was the king of combat sports, the undisputed ruler of the octagon, and tonight was supposed to be just another coronation. The challenger was some washed-up has-been from Philadelphia, a relic from a bygone era of boxing who somehow convinced the commission he deserved a shot. Kane laughed at the absurdity of it all. Rocky Balboa, he spat the name like it tasted bitter. What kind of joke is this? They're bringing me a dinosaur from the 70s to fight a modern gladiator. This ain't even gonna be a fight. It's gonna be a public execution. His crew erupted in laughter, their voices joining the symphony of arrogance that had defined Kane's entire career. He had demolished every opponent, broken spirits and bones with equal ease, and turned the art of fighting into a showcase of his superiority. Tonight would be no different, except the world would finally understand that there was only one true champion. But somewhere in the depths of the arena, in a quiet corner where the noise couldn't reach, an old man sat on a simple wooden stool, wrapping his hands with the same careful precision he'd used for decades. Rocky Balboa's weathered face showed no emotion, no fear, no excitement, just the calm determination of a man who had faced his demons and emerged victorious every single time. The arena's energy reached fever pitch as Kane made his entrance, a spectacular display of lights, pyrotechnics, and thunderous music that declared his arrival like the second coming. He danced down the ramp, shadowboxing with invisible opponents, his every movement calculated to intimidate and awe. The crowd's reaction was split. Half worshipped him like a god, the other half waited for someone, anyone, to humble the arrogant champion. Kane fed off both emotions, his smile growing wider with each step toward the octagon. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed across the arena, "introducing first the undisputed UFC lightweight champion of the world with a record of 34 wins, 0 losses, 28 knockouts, Marcus the Destroyer Kane." The champion raised his arms in triumph, soaking in the adulation like a man who had never known failure. His crew followed behind him, each member carrying themselves with the borrowed confidence of being associated with greatness. Kane climbed into the octagon with the fluid grace of a predator, immediately claiming the center as his territory. He bounced on his toes, throwing combinations that cut through the air with surgical precision. Every punch was a statement, every kick a declaration of war. The cameras loved him. The betting odds favored him overwhelmingly, and even his critics had to admit his physical gifts were undeniable. He was youth, speed, and power incarnate, a perfect fighting machine built for this modern era of combat sports. The champion's corner was a well-oiled machine of modern sports science. Ice baths, oxygen masks, performance analysts with tablets tracking every metric imaginable. Kane's nutritionist had calculated his optimal fighting weight down to the ounce. His conditioning coach had timed his explosive movements to the millisecond, and his sports psychologist had programmed his mind for absolute victory. This wasn't just a fighter, this was the culmination of everything the sport had evolved into. But what he didn't know was that experience doesn't always show up in statistics, that heart can't be measured by modern metrics, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Then came the silence that would change everything. The arena's deafening roar suddenly muted to a whisper as a figure emerged from the opposite tunnel. No pyrotechnics, no music, no spectacle. Just a man walking with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every step through blood, sweat, and an unbreakable will. Rocky Balboa moved like time itself had slowed down, his weathered face telling the story of 1,000 battles, each scar a lesson learned in the crucible of combat. At 62 years old, Rocky should have been a relic, a curiosity from boxing's golden age, who had no business sharing a cage with a modern athlete in his prime. His grey hair was thinning, his face showed the accumulated damage of decades in the ring, and his body had lost the quick twitch explosiveness of youth. But something in his eyes, a depth that Kane had never encountered, suggested that reports of his obsolescence had been greatly exaggerated. And his challenger, the announcer continued with significantly less enthusiasm, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with a professional record that spans 5 decades, Rocky Balboa! The crowd's reaction was markedly different, respectful applause mixed with genuine curiosity and a hint of sympathy for the aging warrior. Many fans remembered his legendary fights, his comeback victories, his ability to absorb punishment that would have ended lesser men. But that was then, and this was now. Rocky's corner was a study in simplicity. His trainer, Mickey's old protege, carried a simple bucket and towel. No high-tech equipment, no performance analysts, no army of specialists, just the basic tools that had served fighters for generations, back when heart mattered more than metrics. Rocky sat on his stool, closing his eyes and breathing deeply, connecting with something internal that couldn't be measured or quantified. Kane watched this display with growing amusement. This wasn't going to be a fight. It was going to be elder abuse, sanctioned by the Athletic Commission. He began to think about what he'd say in the post-fight interview, how he'd explain to the world that even legends have expiration dates, how he'd cement his legacy by retiring a hero who should have known better. The tension in the arena became suffocating as both fighters moved toward the center of the octagon for the referee's final instructions. Kane strutted forward like a peacock, his movements sharp and aggressive, designed to intimidate before the first punch was thrown. He stood inches taller than Rocky, his reach advantage obvious to everyone watching. His skin gleamed with youth and conditioning, every muscle fiber visible beneath the bright lights that seemed to make him glow with an almost supernatural aura. Rocky walked to the center with the steady gait of a man who had faced this moment countless times before. His hands hung loosely at his sides, his breathing was calm and controlled, and his eyes never left Kane's face. There was no showboating, no intimidation tactics, no psychological warfare, just the quiet presence of someone who understood that talk was cheap and results were earned in blood. "I want a clean fight." The referee began his standard instructions, but Kane wasn't listening. Instead, he stared directly into Rocky's eyes, searching for the fear he was accustomed to seeing in his opponent's faces. What he found instead was something he didn't recognize, not confidence, not fear, but a kind of peaceful acceptance that unnerved him more than any trash talk ever could. "You sure you want to do this, old man?" Kane whispered, loud enough for the cameras to pick up. "I don't want to be responsible for ending a legend's life on live television." His smile was all predator, all teeth and malice. The crowd caught pieces of his words, and the tension ratcheted up another notch. Social media exploded with predictions, betting lines shifted dramatically, and somewhere in Philadelphia, an entire neighborhood held its breath. Rocky looked at the young champion for a long moment, then spoke in that distinctive voice that had inspired millions. "Son, I've been doing this since before you was born. Sometimes the old dog still got some fight left in him. The simplicity of his words, delivered without malice or boastfulness, somehow carried more weight than all of Kane's threats combined. But what Kane didn't know was that Rocky had spent the last 6 months preparing for this moment, not just physically, but spiritually, understanding that this fight was about more than just two men in a cage. The bell rang like a gunshot, and Kane exploded into action with the fury of a man determined to end the fight before it truly began. His combinations came in perfect succession: jab, cross, hook, uppercut, each punch thrown with fight-ending intention. His footwork was textbook perfect, his timing was machine-like, and his power was evident in the way the air itself seemed to crack under his strikes. The crowd gasped as his first salvo barely missed Rocky's head by inches, the wind from the punches ruffling the older man's grey hair. Kane moved like liquid lightning, his youth and conditioning obvious in every explosive movement. He threw spinning back fists that could have decapitated a lesser opponent, launched knee strikes that would have crumpled most fighters, and mixed in takedown attempts that showcased his complete mixed martial arts skill set. The statistics on the broadcast screen told the story. Kane was outlanding Rocky 3-1, his strikes were registering higher on the power meters, and his speed was visibly superior in every exchange. But Rocky did something that confused everyone watching. He absorbed the punishment with an almost supernatural calm. Where other fighters would have panicked under Kane's assault, Rocky seemed to be studying his opponent like a scholar examining a particularly interesting text. He moved just enough to avoid the most devastating shots, let his guard absorb what he couldn't avoid entirely, and seemed to be conserving energy while Kane burned through his reserves, trying to score the highlight reel knockout. The crowd began to murmur their confusion. This wasn't how these fights usually went. Typically, Kane's early blitz would leave his opponents unconscious or begging for mercy within the first few minutes. Instead, Rocky stood there like an ancient tree weathering a storm, bending but never breaking, giving ground but never surrendering. His decades of experience had taught him that surviving the initial assault was often the key to victory. By the end of the first round, Kane was breathing harder than expected, while Rocky looked like he was just getting warmed up. But what Kane didn't know was that Rocky had been studying tape of every single one of his fights, identifying the pattern that every previous opponent had missed: Kane's tendency to front-load his energy in pursuit of early knockouts. The second round began with Kane trying to recapture his dominant first-round performance, but something had subtly shifted in the dynamic between the two fighters. His punches still carried devastating power, his speed was still superior, and his technique remained flawless. But Rocky had begun to time his movements, slipping punches by the smallest margins and making Kane work harder for every successful strike. The young champion's frustration began to show in the increasing wildness of his attacks. "Come on, old man," Kane shouted between combinations, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that hadn't been there minutes earlier. "Stand still and take it like a man." But Rocky continued his methodical defense, moving just enough to survive while studying every nuance of Kane's attack patterns. The older fighter's corner remained calm, calling out simple instructions in voices that carried decades of wisdom. Rocky began to land his own shots, not spectacular or flashy, but solid, fundamental punches that carried the accumulated power of a lifetime spent perfecting the sweet science. His jab found its mark repeatedly, snapping Kane's head back with surprising authority. His body shots, thrown with perfect technique, began to slow the champion's explosive movements. Each punch Rocky landed seemed to carry more weight than the metrics suggested, connecting with a precision that spoke to decades of experience. The crowd's energy began to shift as they witnessed something unprecedented. Kane was actually being tested by an opponent who refused to cooperate with his usual script of early domination. The champion's confidence wavered for the first time in his professional career as he realized that his standard approach wasn't working against this enigmatic challenger who seemed to absorb punishment like a sponge and return it with compound interest. Kane's corner began shouting increasingly frantic instructions, their voices betraying the panic that comes with watching an unstoppable force meet an immovable object. The sports science, the perfect conditioning, the flawless technique, none of it seemed to matter against an opponent who fought with something that couldn't be measured or coached. But what Kane didn't understand was that Rocky had fought this exact fight dozens of times before, just against different opponents, wearing different faces. By the fourth round, the impossible was becoming reality before 20,000 stunned witnesses. Kane's explosive power had diminished to desperate swings, his perfect technique had devolved into wild haymakers, and his unshakable confidence had cracked like ice under pressure. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the first drops of blood from Rocky's increasingly accurate counterpunches. The champion who had never faced adversity was learning what it felt like to be in a real fight for the first time in his career. Rocky, meanwhile, seemed to be growing stronger with each passing minute. His movements became more fluid, his punches more precise, and his timing more perfect. It was as if the accumulated wisdom of every fight he'd ever been in was flowing through him, guiding his hands and feet with an intelligence that transcended mere physical ability. The crowd watched in awe as the aging warrior systematically dismantled the myth of Kane's invincibility. "This can't be happening," Kane gasped to his corner during a brief clinch, his voice barely audible over the crowd's growing excitement. His trainers shouted conflicting advice, their panic evident as their perfectly planned strategy crumbled before their eyes. The sports science that had guaranteed victory was proving useless against an opponent who operated on principles older than their modern understanding of combat. Kane attempted one last desperate assault, throwing everything he had left in a furious combination that would have ended any other fight. But Rocky stepped inside the attack, absorbed what he couldn't avoid, and countered with an uppercut that traveled perhaps 6 inches but carried the force of a lifetime's worth of determination. The punch connected with Kane's chin with a sound like thunder, and for the first time in his career, the undefeated champion's legs betrayed him. The arena fell silent as Kane stumbled backward, his eyes unfocused, his perfect balance suddenly as fragile as his shattered confidence. But what he didn't know was that this moment had been inevitable from the instant he chose arrogance over respect, when he mistook age for weakness and experience for obsolescence. Time seemed suspended as Kane fought to remain conscious, his body betraying him for the first time in his professional life. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the man who had seemed invincible moments before struggled to maintain his footing. His vision blurred, his coordination failed, and the reality of his situation crashed over him like a cold wave. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him, not to the perfect fighter, not to the man who had redefined what it meant to be dominant. Rocky didn't celebrate or showboat as Kane stumbled. Instead, he moved forward with the measured pace of a man who understood that true victory wasn't about humiliation, but about proving a point that transcended personal glory. His follow-up punches were precise and purposeful, not meant to inflict unnecessary damage, but to complete the lesson that had been building since the opening bell. The end came with a right hand that seemed to travel in slow motion, giving Kane just enough time to realize what was happening, but not enough to prevent it. The punch landed clean on his temple, and the undefeated champion collapsed to the canvas like a felled tree. The silence in the arena was absolute, 20,000 people holding their breath as they witnessed the impossible becoming reality. Kane lay motionless for what felt like an eternity, his chest rising and falling as his mind struggled to process what had just occurred. His perfect record was gone, his aura of invincibility shattered, and his understanding of his own abilities completely rewritten. The belt that had defined his identity lay beside him on the canvas, suddenly feeling more like a burden than a treasure. But what he couldn't have known was that this moment of defeat would become the most important lesson of his life, teaching him that true strength comes not from never falling, but from learning how to get back up with humility and wisdom. As Kane slowly regained consciousness, the world around him had fundamentally changed. The crowd that had cheered his dominance now watched in respectful silence as Rocky helped him to his feet, not as a conqueror gloating over the defeated, but as one warrior showing respect to another. The gesture confused Kane more than the knockout itself. In his world, victory meant humiliation for the loser, yet this man, who had just destroyed his perfect record, was treating him with a dignity he had never shown his own opponents. "You got heart, kid," Rocky said quietly, his voice barely audible over the arena's stunned murmur. "But heart without humility is just pride waiting to fall." The words hit Kane harder than any physical blow he had absorbed during the fight. For the first time in his adult life, he was forced to confront the difference between being a fighter and being a warrior, between winning fights and understanding what fighting truly meant. The medical team rushed into the octagon, but Kane waved them away, insisting on standing under his own power. His legs were unsteady, his pride was shattered, but something deeper was beginning to emerge from the wreckage of his arrogance. He looked around the arena with new eyes, seeing the faces of fans he had dismissed, recognizing the respect that Rocky commanded simply by being who he was, rather than what he had accomplished. Kane's entourage stood at ringside in shock, their meal ticket suddenly looking very different than it had an hour earlier. The phones that had been documenting his anticipated triumph now captured his moment of reckoning. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from celebration to disbelief, but Kane was no longer paying attention to the noise that had once fed his ego. Instead, he found himself studying Rocky's face, searching for the source of the strength that had just redefined his understanding of what it meant to be a champion. But what he was only beginning to understand was that true championship wasn't about avoiding defeat. It was about how you responded when defeat found you anyway. 6 months later, Marcus Kane stood in a different kind of gym, one without cameras or crowds, where the only sounds were the rhythmic thudding of heavy bags and the quiet wisdom of an old man who had agreed to train the fighter who once mocked him. The platinum teeth were gone, replaced by a humbler smile that reached his eyes. The designer clothing had given way to simple gym gear, and the entourage had been replaced by genuine friendships built on respect rather than profit. Kane's new record showed 2 losses, one in the octagon to Rocky and one to his own ego in the mirror every morning since. But he was winning fights again, this time with a style that combined his natural gifts with the wisdom Rocky had shared. His opponents found themselves facing a fighter who was not only skilled but humble, not only powerful but wise, not only determined to win but equally determined to honor the sport and his opponents. "The difference between a fighter and a warrior," Rocky explained during one of their training sessions, "ain't about how many times you win. It's about what you learn when you lose and whether you got the courage to become better because of it." Kane absorbed these lessons like a man drinking water after years in the desert, finally understanding that his greatest victory wasn't his undefeated streak, but his willingness to be defeated and transformed. The gym's walls were covered with pictures of champions from every era, each one representing a different lesson about what it meant to fight with honor. Kane's photo was there too now, but not from his undefeated days. It was from the moment Rocky helped him to his feet, teaching him that true champions lift others up rather than standing on their broken bodies. As Kane worked the heavy bag under Rocky's watchful eye, he realized that losing to Rocky Balboa was the best thing that had ever happened to him. It had cost him his perfect record, but given him something infinitely more valuable: the understanding that strength without character is just violence, that skill without humility is just showing off, and that true champions are made not in moments of victory, but in how they handle their defeats. Sometimes the greatest victory comes disguised as a defeat, and the strongest opponent is the one who teaches you who you really are. If this story reminded you that there's always more to learn, always room to grow, comment below with your own comeback story. And if you believe that legends never really retire, they just pass their wisdom to the next generation, hit that subscribe button and join a community that understands what true championship really means.